Okay, so let me do just a brief overview from the beginning. So we talked about the core events in 1 Corinthians 15, the death, resurrection. Those kind of always go together. Even if a New Testament writer doesn't mention both, he usually is assuming both to some degree. The death only really does what it's supposed to do if there's a resurrection on the other side of it. If Jesus dies and stays dead, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, we're still in our sins and we're basically wasting our time. So for Paul, for sure, we can kind of assume he uses cross as kind of a shorthand. He's referring to the front event, but he really references both of them and is assuming both of them. Most of the times he's talking about the cross, but sometimes he'll explicitly talk about the resurrection, like in Romans 4. Towards the end, he says Jesus was raised for our justification. And so it's some ways Jesus' death justifies his mission, his resurrection justifies his mission, but it also applies to us as well. And so some of that's what we've been wrestling through is how do we think about the effects and the applications of the work of Christ. So it's not just that we want to understand what Jesus did, it's we want to understand why it matters. And that's where the pictures we've been working through, I think, are helpful. So after we talked about death and resurrection, we pointed out that in order for him to die, specifically the type of death he needed to die, well, he had to become a human first, because you have to be human to be killed, generally speaking. And then he had to live a certain kind of life. So it wasn't just that he could have, if you remember a few weeks back, we talked about, well, why couldn't he have just died when Herod was eradicating all the babies? Like, why wouldn't that have worked? Because it would have been he became a human and then he died. But why would that have not been sufficient? And it's because he needed to live a certain type of life. He needed to reach maturity. He needed to reach adulthood. He needed to experience the full range of what it means to be human from a developmental perspective. Doesn't mean he had to experience every single thing that is possible. Humanly, it's that he needed to go through all the stages of human development. So before he could die, he had to live a certain kind of life. He had to become a human. But then sometimes we lose, and these will be more prominent after Easter because we have a Ascension service. We have an Ascension Day. It's not on the Ascension Day usually. We might this year though. But then we also celebrate Pentecost. So these ideas that it's not just that Jesus was resurrected, it's that he then ascends to heaven. He rules and reigns from heaven. He sends his spirit. He intercedes for us. And then we're still waiting on the last piece of the puzzle for an actual return to fully complete the work of Christ. So in some ways we can say the work of Christ is completed, is a work in progress, and it waits a future consummation. So it's kind of all things. It's already, and it's not yet, is the language the theologians will use. We haven't talked about these in a lot of detail, but they are part of the work of Christ. Any questions on that so far? As we jump back into, we talked about significant pictures. We did these three last week, so we'll talk about these three this week. Any questions about the ones from last week, though? Let's see if I told you there wasn't going to be a quiz, but let's do a quiz. So sacrifice, what was the realm that sacrifice was a part of?
The Old Testament.
The Old Testament. Well, they're all connected to the Old Testament, but what part of the Old Testament? What?
Actual sacrifice of animals
Okay.
in the temple.
Yeah, which is part of, it's a W word.
Right.
What's the W word? No. Worship.
Worship, yeah.
Yeah, so the sacrifice, it's best to think of sacrifices as that's part of their, you say cult, but that makes it sound bad because when we hear cult, we think of like, well, I don't know what you think of, but we don't think of good things generally. But cult in Old Testament uses is just a way of talking about a culture's religious practices. So they had religious practices that involved sacrifice, and so the sacrificial picture is tapping into that imagery to draw comparisons between what Jesus did and what an ancient Israelite would do on a given Sabbath. Well, I don't know if it'd be on a given Sabbath, but one of the outcomes of this is, generally speaking, now we don't have to bring lambs to church, although someone will next week. But thankfully, we are not having to do that anymore. The church is less like a butcher shop moving forward. So, what about Victor? What's the realm for that one? We're triumph over death. So, but it's construing death as an entity to be defeated. So it's using the language of, it's another W word. Trump said we wouldn't have any more of them. Wars, yeah. So it's using the warfare language. It's almost in some of the ways it gets talked about, it's almost personifying sin, death, as these spiritual things that have a power over us that somehow Jesus defeats through his death. So there's a sense in which death is this sort of master of which we're enslaved. Jesus dies death. I don't know if that makes sense. Jesus dies a death that somehow defeats death as a entity. But we don't think of, I mean, if we want to be literal, it's not that death is a literal entity, although most of the people in the ancient world had a god of death that they associated with that concept. So even if you think that, then this warfare language applies there. But more generally, Jesus being resurrected defeats the concept of death in some ultimate sense that we have yet to experience. So worship, warfare, not a W word, but what was substitute? All these have substitutionary elements, but there's a particular substitute that we talked about. Law. Are you checking notes, or are you just going straight off memory? Okay. Yeah, so so law. Well, we weren't grading it. It was kind of an open quiz. Group quizzes are always different too. So the law court element of, I am guilty. I've done things that have generated some kind of penalty, and Jesus somehow substitutes for me, takes on my guilt, pays the penalty that I owe. And then a lot of people, Luther's famous for this great exchange language that goes with this picture, where if we're conceiving of it in a legal context, it's not only that Jesus takes my bad track record and it takes it on himself, pays the penalty for it, but in exchange, I get his perfect track record. So it's a both and kind of imagery, which actually kind of works against the way we think of law courts today. It'd be almost as if the judge gets down off the bench and takes your spot in the defendant's chair and then absorbs the penalty, but then you get to not just walk free, but actually have a positive track record moving forward. So it doesn't bring you back to neutral in the way this metaphor is construed.
That only happens if the judge if the victim is the judge's kid, and he makes a fine and then goes and pays it.
Right. Yeah, so there are ways it can happen. The way it gets tricky, though, in thinking about it in a traditional Christian context, is we're thinking about God in Trinitarian terms. So it's not as if God the Father is one entity and God the Son is another entity, and God the Father is the judge and the Son kind of steps in. So that historically we think of them as they're one being, so it's a single entity. So when we think about, if you want to construe substitution to include a punishment element to it, it's not as if God the Father is punishing his Son on your behalf. Because we think of them as one being, it's God as an entity absorbing his own wrath. So it's not him pouring his wrath out on another thing or another person or another entity. It's him actually absolving the problem within his own being, which is something we can't really conceive of because we're singular individuals and we can't think of what it would be like to be tri-personal, which is why we don't really try to figure it out. It's part of the confession that we make in the Nicene Creed. We confess that we believe it to be true. We don't confess that we understand how it works or could explain it in any way that would actually make sense the more you kind of push on it. I've tried. So it's lots of student questions through the years. I've tried all sorts of different ways. None of them really fully work. They illuminate a little bit, But then if you think about it a little bit more, it's like, well, that's not actually how it works. Okay, so those were our 3 from last week. Are we clear on those? Any follow-up thoughts, questions, comments?
So the sacrifice was the worship, the victory over war, and the substitute over equal, trading it in.
Yeah, so I think the slide may say legal substitute on substitute, because there's really a substitutionary element in all of these to some degree. I might have to think through, maybe there needs to be a different word there, because there is a, like, Jesus fights the battle I can't fight. Jesus presents the perfect worship I can't present. Jesus buys me out of slavery when I couldn't buy myself out. So he's substituting in different ways in all of them. They're all trying to unpack what we confess in the creed, where we say he died for us. What does that mean, for us? The prepositions are what get you. It spends a lot of time trying to unpack them.
So why do you have substitute there, if it's in all of them?
Because I made this before I took a PhD seminar on atonement, and now I complicated all the ways I think about it. So going back to the more straightforward version, and you'll get the updated version next spring, to the extent that I can control those sorts of things.
I keep hearing the word pictures, things in pictures. These seem concepts to me. Are we using them interchangeably, or?
Are we using picture and concept interchangeably is what you're asking? Yes. Yeah, I think so. I'm using the language of picture because they each are kind of conjuring up. They're inviting you to use your imagination to kind of conceive, so concept.
Kind of an image?
Yeah. So some of what I'm going to push off into the spring is the question of, well, which one's the real one? Like, they're all sort of metaphorical to some extent, but which one is the actual non-metaphorical mechanism of what happens? So you're going to have to come back next year for that, but...
We have to have it when we're here.
Well, we'll do it around Easter. Easter is at the end of March next year, so this class would start in February. Well, I guess we started in February this year.
But you're being filmed and this is broadcast, right?
I think so.
The thing that amazes me all through these is we're talking about somebody who, if we had been there, we could touch.
Mm-hmm.
Real person.
Mm-hmm.
Who was also God.
Yeah.
Incarnate. I mean, and that is the part that goes through all of those. That here's a being we could identify with.
Mm-hmm.
Something that doesn't exist in other religions, really.
Sure.
That's who came and was apparent to people, who met with people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think about the writers, some of whom actually knew him, followed him.
Right.
Paul didn't, except for a meeting on the road to Damascus. But
Yeah, you're highlighting some of the continuity and discontinuity with the other ancient religions, right?
yeah, well, a complete discontinuity. I don't believe that, at least as far as I've studied anything about them, that there is a real person. I mean, gods came down and interfered with mankind,
Right.
but they weren't. You couldn't touch them, so to speak. Or if you did, you were in big trouble.
Yeah, well, that's where the language of incarnation is so important. Is it's not just a manifestation. So Greek mythology has all sorts of manifestations of gods that came down and engaged with humans, but they're projected so far back into ancient history that, and we don't necessarily even think they're literal stories. Like, they think of them as explanatory myths that are trying to make sense of the world, but that's not the way the Gospels are presenting.
And that is part of the work was actually being a human being.
Mhm.
Having to reject all the good things, an ability to accept the blame.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is the thread running through it, is none of these work if it's just a human doing it. Because if it's just a human, it has to, the person has to be a human, but the person has to be more than a human. And I think our lectionary passage today is focused on that. I don't know how much Jared's going to dial into it in his sermon, but we have, or is it next week? Our recording schedule is weird. So the one it's next week. It's Philippians 2, 5 through 11, where it really talks about this. He takes on the form of a servant. What does that actually entail? But he doesn't cease to be God, but there's a kind of humiliation and then an exaltation. So the humiliation part is being forced to become a man. Not forced, I don't want to use that language. Willingly becoming a human, starting as a baby. It would have been a lot easier to just come down as a full-grown man and just kind of go from there. But he has to go all the way, be born, be an infant, be a baby, be a kid, be a teenager, be an adult, move through all of those stages of humanity, yet being God at the same time and having this awareness of a mission, a calling that he talks about, and he's very clear with his disciples what that is, and they don't understand it. And then like we looked in our illustration, after the resurrection, they're like, oh, that's what he was talking about. Even though he said it in so many words, it took the actual experience of the resurrected Christ for it to actually click into place for the disciples. Let's slide ahead. So we did sacrifice, victor, substitute, legal substitute, because there's other substitutes. So I talked about redeemer. I think we didn't talk about it in detail. Sometimes redemption and atonement get used interchangeably, and they can be to some extent. So we say it's Christ's work of redemption, but we could also say it's his work of reconciliation. So this is where it gets a little tricky. Some of these words have distinct meanings, but they're not meanings that are totally unrelated. So we use the word redeem a lot. But the picture that's being used, that an ancient person would have thought about when you use that kind of language, predominantly is being bought out of slavery. So, and it's not just being purchased. I think it's fair to say it's not just that it's the picture as a person going to the slave market and purchasing a slave and then taking them home and putting them to work, so much as it's a picture of a person going to a slave market and buying a slave and then granting them free status. So you're being bought out of, you're not just being transferred. But there is sort of a transfer of ownership element, because Paul is going to use this language. Paul, a servant of Jesus, he uses that language a lot. Even in the lectionary passage I just mentioned, where it talks about Jesus became a servant, the Greek word for that is doulos, and it's really the word for slave. So in English, it feels like it softens it. If we say slave, we immediately think antebellum South, chattel slavery involving the ownership of another race of people that we think is lesser than. In the ancient world, that's not the way slavery would have functioned primarily. Generally speaking, if you're walking around the marketplace, the agora, and you see people, you can't necessarily tell by skin color who is or isn't a slave. Dress is going to be a little bit more of a feature, but in the Roman world, they actually didn't want to make the slaves look distinctive, because especially at this point in time, if the slaves realized how many of them there actually were, they could have very easily revolted and taken over, because they outnumbered freed and wealthy people pretty significantly, and the whole economy relied on their existence. So if they kind of knew who all was in this together, they could have actually done a lot of, so they didn't want them to be visually identifiable. So you were primarily a slave in the ancient world because your people were conquered by the Romans, as one example, or you fell into debt and you couldn't just declare bankruptcy and move on with your life. Your debtors, you would sell yourself into slavery to help pay off debts. Usually that was a time-bound reality. It wasn't just an indefinite, I'm going to be somebody's slave moving forward. It was more of a, it's going to take me 5 years to pay this off, so I'm going to go serve this person in this capacity for X number of years. And so there was a racial element in some sense in the ancient world, but it was not racial as a primary motivation. But it was a lot more part of their economy than it was for the South in America 150 years ago.
It was an indenture of sort.
You could have indentured servitude, yeah.
So during the Jubilee year, the slaves were given freedom.
That's what they're told to do in the Deuteronomy passage from a few weeks ago for Israel. The Roman Empire didn't work like that, so they don't care about that sort of thing. Slaves, it is probably fair to still draw the comparison of slaves they're not subhuman, but they are property in kind of the same, not quite the same way, but in a similar way to way they thought about them in the American South. You're owned by your master to some extent.
Like in human trafficking.
Yeah, that might be a better modern comparison. But at the same time, that has a subjugation element to it and an exploitation element to it. And there were people in the ancient world who were slaves in terms of their technical economic status who lived very comfortable, very easy lives. Usually because they had a skill that was valuable to their master. And so that kept them from, like a lot of scribes would have potentially been slaves, or there were slaves who were literate and could write. And so were treated very well by the master. You had you didn't have any bills. You had all your meals for free. You were treated well because they don't want to like beat you up or maim you because they need you to be able to work. But at the same time, you're not free to just move about and do whatever you want with your life. You can only do what your master allows for you to do. So you don't have freedom, but you don't necessarily have exploitation in the same way that human trafficking would.
Also like being sold.
Kind of, yeah. You're not your own. You belong to somebody else. You can't just do what you want. So I say all that to say is if we really want to use this picture, and it's really relying on the concept of slavery, and then we have the concept of slave traced through the New Testament, we have to kind of demystify what that language is pointing at so that we don't think of what's the most recent thing for us to think about, which is, it must be like this. So otherwise, it's already a little provocative for Paul to call himself a slave and to talk about being a slave to Christ. If slave inherently means subjugated, exploited, treated as subhuman.
Here you have the concept of sin, which wouldn't have necessarily applied in Roman or Greek society.
Yeah.
Probably in Hebrew society to a degree, but not in that context for Roman society.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a development with the way Paul's going to use it in some of the passages I highlight here, where I think it's probably fair to say in the Old Testament, the sin language is mostly related to activities and actions, failing to do something you were supposed to do, doing something you weren't supposed to do. But when we get into the New Testament, Paul in particular talks about sin in some ways where it sounds like it's this metaphysical entity that somehow we are subjected to. And so that's why when we think of Jesus buying us out of slavery to sin and death, we're now kind of intersecting with the victor concept of sin and death. In this picture, sin and death are a slave master that own humanity, and Jesus buys them out of slavery to sin and death and sets them free. And so in that case, sin and death are personified again. You can kind of see this if you wanted to. We don't have time now, but if you wanted to see this a little more clearly on your own, you can pay attention in the New Testament to the distinction between sin and sins. For the most part, anytime you see sins in the plural, it's talking about activities and actions that people have committed or shouldn't commit or something like that. They're tangible things you do or don't do. Sin, though, a lot of the ways it's talked about in the singular, it sounds more like a disease that infects everybody and causes them to do sins. So the way I kind of think of it is sin is the underlying disease and sins are the symptoms that manifest because of sin. And so you, as any good medical doctor knows, you don't treat the symptoms, you try to figure out what the root causes are and you deal with the disease. So redemption deals with the disease, the outworking of which is going to eliminate symptoms over time. So instead of just telling people, hey, you need to stop sinning, Jesus defeats the power of sin at its root so that then people will stop sinning or have the power to. A lot of the language in Romans, especially 6-8, is trying to get people to realize because of what Christ has done, because of sending the Spirit, you now have the power to not sin. It's not as if you automatically just do all the right things moving forward. It's that you're not in this, your will is no longer in bondage to then do the things you don't have to do. The best picture of that I think about a lot is, have you read The Count of Monte Cristo? You get bonus points if you have. She has. I have not. But I've watched it. Have you seen the movie with Jim Caviezel? You can remember? Yes. I don't want to rehearse the whole plot, but there's a very pivotal, I don't know if it's pivotal. You could judge whether it's pivotal. There's a scene where he has gotten out of prison, he's amassed all this wealth, and then he's living in this castle, and he's still choosing to sleep on the floor. So he has this wonderful, ornate, presumably comfortable bed, but because he's so accustomed to being in prison and to sleeping on the hard floor, that's what's still comfortable. So he has the power to go sleep in the comfortable bed, but he defaults to the uncomfortable thing that is more familiar to him. And some of what Paul is getting at in Romans 6-8 particularly is that's the way we tend to function. We tend to default to our old bad habits because they're just comfortable and easy. But because of the Spirit, we have the power to do new and different things, to submit ourselves to righteousness rather than unrighteousness. But it's still kind of putting some of the, I don't say pressure, but some of the responsibility on us. It's not this sort of automatic, like, yeah, you just sort of, let go and let God. It's like, no, you've been empowered to move forward in a certain way, but you have to actually do it. So redemption, we think about it like that. That hopefully puts it in a little more 3D of you're being bought out of sin and slavery to sin and death, set free to live a righteous life, and also given the power to do so. Questions, thoughts? You may be excused, yes. It's been a long time since I've had to let a student leave in the middle of class. Make sure you take a hall pass.
I'll bring it back.
Okay, yeah.
Especially with a student that's twice your age.
Yeah. It's usually the other way around. Yeah.
To accept this means constant interaction with God.
Yeah.
Because life is full of decisions. Because we're imperfect, we're going to make mistakes. But if we evaluate conduct constantly, which is something that the Hebrews of the Old Testament would probably have understood, but they had an easy way to fix it. Just go out and get yourself anywhere from a bull to a pair of turtle doves, depending on your class or wealth.
Just even thinking about, I always think about that, like, how do you get the turtle doves? Like they make that sound like that's the easier thing. It's like, well, you could bring a bull or a lamb or a ram, or you could catch 2 birds.
Well, I don't know. I suspect.
They weren't raising them.
I suspect
Here's an
that.
aviary.
Remember, Christ drives the money changer and a bunch of animals out of the temple.
Yeah.
Obviously, they were available there.
Right. I'm thinking of the original instructions when they're in the wilderness and they're like, where are we supposed to find these birds? But one of the problems with that, though, is if you read those early chapters in Leviticus, there's no sacrifice you can make for things you do on purpose. So it isn't quite the case that, I could just go make a sacrifice, it'll make it better. So if you do any its language is high-handed, meaning you know what you did was wrong and you did it anyways. There's no provision.
Yeah, I understand that, but presumably the conscious person would avoid those sins. Whereas because he's imperfect, he's going to commit the other ones whether he wants to or not,
Right.
or has the power.
Yeah.
And we're covered in that.
Yeah. And we don't have to. And I mean, I think in some ways we lose sight of what a burden was lifted because we didn't have to live under the old covenant with the sacrificial system and have to keep track of all these things. And, just imagine all the calculus you're having to do on the way to church on Sunday morning if it's an old covenant reality. It's like, well, do I have... But that's also assuming we're all farmers and we have livestock and it's an agrarian culture. And, it's not even, in some ways, things had to change because everything you have in the Old Testament is geared towards a certain type of culture and people. And in order for the gospel to actually be applicable across broad cultures, it has to be changed. Not the gospel has to be changed, but the way to relate to God has to fundamentally change, or it's forever going to be time bound to a certain type of lifestyle that God in his infinite wisdom knew the world was not going to stay like that for the duration of human history. So we're grateful that we don't have to bring livestock to church, but also that we don't have to do all this calculus in the relationship, though we do have a relationship that requires a level of proactivity. So I'm going to use that to pivot into the next one. So I think we covered this. So the sphere is the slave market. You're in bondage. Christ's work delivers us. We get freedom. So reconciler is really where the language of atonement primarily comes from. So the word I think I mentioned this first week, the word atonement is, like all words, a made up word that's at one-ment. So I think it was William Tyndale, in trying to translate a certain Greek word into English, didn't have really a good English word at hand. And so creates this word atonement, but it's to capture what is elsewhere translated as reconciliation in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, it's a different word, different concept. But in the New Testament, this idea of reconciliation, what is that? How do we capture that? And so in some ways, this could be the master picture of ultimately at the end of the day, what we're talking about is Jesus is restoring our relationship with God and eliminating the alienation between us and God. So you can picture that as this warfare metaphor. You can picture this in a legal setting. You can picture this in a court setting. You can picture this in a slave market setting. But at the end of the day, they're all kind of filtering into this concept to some degree or another. But it is its own separate picture. It's the picture of familial relations, of estrangement has occurred, and the two parties need to be brought together in some way. And so the question though, that a lot of times what we have with this is who is being reconciled to whom. And the idea is sometimes it can be construed as God is mad at you and Jesus has to convince him to give you a second chance. And so then he changes his mind and decides to be your friend again. But that's actually the opposite way of the way the biblical writers picture it. It's that you are the one who is at enmity with God and upset or frustrated by, and you're the one who's turned your back on God. And it's Jesus's work on the cross that turns you around to reconcile you to God. It's not that God doesn't want to engage with you, it's that you don't want to engage with God.
So which one's right?
The second one. The other one, you hear it maybe a lot in popular presentations of the gospel. It's just sort of like, God's upset at you, and so he has to pour out all his wrath onto Jesus. Jesus absorbs it all, and then now you guys can be good. But again, what we were talking about earlier, if they're the same being, then that doesn't work because that's visualizing two people. It's visualizing three entities. There's an angry person, there's a not innocent, but there's a person who's the object of the anger, and then there's a mediator that gets in between and changes the angry person's mind by absorbing all the wrath from the angry person.
Jonathan Edwards did that one.
He's complicated. mean, he's most famous for Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, the sermon that he preached that sometimes elementary school children have to read. And I don't know, why did you all have to read that?
Because Carrie was a big fan.
Okay, well, so he has so much other, I mean, I could go on Edwards for a little bit, but it's just wild to me that he's known as the guy that is like, God hates you and is going to throw you in hell. But he's also the guy that like went out into the woods and made up songs, and like, I don't know, just his personality does not mesh with what he's popularly known with. The other thing to picture is when and I'll do this because I could do it, when he's delivering that sermon that everybody talks about, he's doing it like this, like, and reading it in monotone, because that's how he preached. He's not this kind of fiery, like, he held up a candle and he had his manuscript and he just kind of read through it, and that was the sermon.
Because his manuscript has such explosive phrases in it, he could have been powerful.
He could have been, but that was not his personality. He was a tall, shy introvert that liked to go off in the woods and think deep thoughts and then come back and tell you about them. But it's very inspirational if you think about it. He was on the younger side. Yeah. Anyways, Edwards he's an interesting person. Potentially the greatest theological, like whether you agree with him or not, the greatest theological mind America has ever produced, yet was never an American in the modern sense, because he died before 1776. I think. Is that right? Yeah, he died in like 17. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We've never produced a theologian of that stature. They're all European or somewhere else. Usually German, for what it's worth. But back to reconciliation. We have just enough time, I think, to finish up here and then talk about the next one. But this idea of it's not God who needs to be turned back to me, it's me who needs to be turned back to God. Because Jesus and God are one being, it's God doing all the work to turn me towards him. It's not part of God is mad at me and another part is okay with me and has to kind of convince God to like me again.
That's an interesting concept, which I remember, I've forgotten where in the service it says it, but it describes Christ as our only mediator and advocate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that is kind of in this neighborhood of, but what he's advocating for is not God needs to be okay with me. It's the advocacy is he's representing his perfect worship over and over again, thus kind of making atonement this thing that happens perpetually in heaven, not something that has to be enacted on earth. So the outcome of all of this, though, is we're in the sphere of relationships. We are alienated and actually like the alienation to some extent, but Christ's work undoes the alienation, makes peace between God and man, and so the result is this ongoing peace. So the last one, this will be a good setup for the fall when we spend some time in the prophets. I don't know if you all remember, I remember talking about this one before we really got into it because it's a little more complicated, but it's this idea of Jesus is, the technical term is recapitulation. But I didn't want to put that up there, so I used second Adam. It would have worked, though, because then it would have been redemption, reconciler, recapitulation. But again, we're not Baptists, so we don't have to alliterate. But second Adam, Jesus succeeds in obedience where Adam in the Genesis narrative fails, but where Israel as a nation throughout the Old Testament also fails. So there's a sense in which Genesis 1 through 11 is this kind of prologue to get us to Abraham, to then talk about Israel as an entity, as a nation, as God's chosen people. But Adam as an individual is kind of a representative ahead of time of what Israel would be. So he is God's chosen person. He's put in the garden. He's given a task. He's told to be fruitful, multiply. He's told to keep and work the garden. The idea being that the garden would spread out into the wilderness and eventually there would be no more wilderness. But instead he disobeys and then is cast out into the wilderness and now has to try to get back to the garden, which he can't because there's it's guarded, or at least try to create the garden on his own in the wilderness, which he can't do. So there's this constant struggle of, we know we're meant to live in a garden, but we're stuck living in the wilderness. So Adam fails that way. Then Israel is kind of set up for similar success. They're going to go into the promised land. The garden is kind of a proto-promised land. Adam's put in the garden. Israel's planted in the promised land. They're supposed to be fruitful, multiply, fill the land, and spread a certain style of relating to God through a national structure to the rest of the world. They're supposed to be a light to the nations. People are going to come to Israel, see how things are done there, spread from there. And at the height of Israel's dominion, maybe is the word. It's in Solomon's reign, but I think it's right before. It's like 1 Kings 10, 11, somewhere in there. It talks about Israel. It uses explicit language of has been fruitful, multiplied. There's riches, there's wealth. The boundaries of the nation of Israel are the largest they would ever be at that point in time. But the attentive reader will have noticed early in the king's narrative, Solomon was doing all the things that Deuteronomy said a king was not supposed to be doing. He was not supposed to multiply chariots. He was not supposed to amass wealth. He was not supposed to marry foreign women, which we construe that, I think we talked about this, we construe that as more of a, like, he had an insatiable desire for women. And it's really more, he was making treaties with other nations, and that's how you made treaties with other nations.
900 of them?
The math doesn't really math if you think about it. I think it's hyperbole. That's a whole different discussion of whenever you have big round numbers like that, a lot of times it's hyperbolic I don't know that there was 900 available princesses in the ancient world to marry, even if he wanted to marry every single one of them. But he had more than any reasonable person would ever consider. I see that eyebrow.
More than one is unreasonable, sir.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Good point.
That was implied. It was implied. Anyways, he's doing all these things, and then eventually everything falls apart. So the king fails. He's kind of a representative of Israel, but the nation as a whole also they're always having to be told not to worship the Baals. Then they worship the Baals. Like, it's just over and over and over again. Hey, don't worship the other gods. They keep hedging their bets with the other gods. The reason they worship Baal so much is Baal was the god of fertility and harvest. And if you're a people who relies on fertility and harvest in order to perpetuate your culture, it's always going to be a temptation to worship this neighboring deity who is specific. If for no other reason, like, well, we worship Yahweh, but why don't we should probably be on Baal's good side if we can help it. Just, let's do both. And so, but that's why there's all this language of I alone am the Lord. You will worship only me. You're not going to worship the gods of the other nations. But Israel fails. So Adam and Israel both fail. Jesus succeeds where they failed. And that's part of what we get in the gospel narratives of. It's not just that he had to live a certain kind of life or a sinless life. He had to succeed in some specific ways where they failed. And that's the recapitulation element. It's this idea that Jesus, in a picturesque form, sort of relives the story of Israel. That's one of the big reasons Matthew has him going down into Egypt and then coming back up. So it's some symmetry with Israel goes down into Egypt, comes back up. Then he can quote Hosea, out of Egypt I called my son, which was talking about Israel, but now he's applying it to Jesus, suggesting Jesus is the new Israel or a representative of the new Israel. So Adam's failure leads to disorder. Jesus' success leads to restoration. There's a lot we could double click on here. It's a big thing in Romans 5, 12 through 19. I remember we did a Romans Bible study at the last church I was at, and it felt like it turned into a Genesis Bible study because we kept having to go back to clarify, like, okay, well, here's what's going on in Genesis. Here's how Paul's redeploying it to explain things going on with Jesus. So we might try that here. I don't know. Okay, so this picture works within really the broadest sphere possible, the created world. There's disorder and decay and disarray because of what Adam did, what Israel could have been part of the solution for, but ultimately failed. Therefore, Jesus steps in and obeys and does the right things where they did the wrong things, and it leads to restoration. Although we would say it leads to restoration in an already not yet sense of the cosmos has been set right in some ways and is clearly not fully set right in other ways, because we still see death, decay, disease, all of these things that should not be. But that's where I think the D-Day, VE Day kind of distinction tends to work well. Of Jesus' death and resurrection is D-Day for sin, death, disorder, decay, all of these things. But his second coming is Victory in Europe Day, where it's actually fully ended and put to rest, and we're living in between those two. The battle has ultimately been won. Well, but the war has ultimately been won. There are still ongoing battles and skirmishes because of that, because it doesn't happen uniformly. But the decisive victory has already happened. And so we're living in between those two. The apostles thought it was going to be, he's going to come back next year. It was very clear they thought he was coming right back. And then as time went on, it was clear that he was not coming right back. So we got to write things down. We got to pass it on to the next generation. We got to kind of assume it's going to be a while. And then Jerusalem gets sacked, the temple destroyed, people are scattered, and then they go from there. But I should probably you can ask me questions later. I should close in prayer because we need to get over next door. But it was fun going through some of this stuff with you. I'm looking forward to the class I'll do over the summer is going to be on the different theological traditions. So we can learn all about Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Lutheranism, Calvinism, Arminian, all the isms, and then ask ourselves a question of which one is Anglicanism? How does it intersect with all of these other ones? So I'll be back doing that probably sometime in June. But before that, we'll learn what Anglicans are with Jared. So let me close us in prayer and we'll head over. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to gather here together to study the work of Christ, to try to understand it better, to do theology together in community. And we ask that you're with us as we go over and hear the word preached. In Jesus' name, amen.